Hey guys, welcome to The Refined Savage. On today's show, we have Dr. Paul Rahe from Hillsdale College in Michigan. Dr. Rahe is a leading author, best-selling author, and professor at Hillsdale College, and he is an expert on Greek military schemes and Spartans in general. So we talked to him about the Spartans, about the Persians in the battle for the West. I think you're really going to dig this one, guys. Enjoy! Well, looks like we're up and running.
All right, good.
So we are here at Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan with Dr. Paul Rahe. And we're up here because you are an expert in... What do you teach here at Hillsdale?
It's complicated.
Okay.
I am in the history department for undergraduate teaching, and then I teach in the graduate program in statesmanship and political philosophy. So... a politics graduate program.
Hillsdale's more of a conservative-leaning school, isn't it?
Well, in a certain sense, yes. In another sense, it's just old-fashioned.
Right.
It's people ask me, what's it like? And I say, Williams College, 1955, with girls. And it's a school with an interesting history. It was an abolitionist school. Founded by Free Will Baptists, non-denominational Christian, though the Baptists founded it.
Right.
It was from day one co-ed and from day one multiracial. So there's never been racial discrimination here.
Oh, that's really interesting.
It was de facto a Protestant school for a long, long time. Now maybe 1/3 of the students are Catholic. Maybe 1/3 of the faculty is Catholic. And the mission statement of 1844 is still the mission statement today. And the curriculum looks like the curriculum of Williams College, 1955. So to give you a sense, you conservative leaning, we don't have any public policy courses.
Okay.
In other words, we don't have any advocacy courses.
Right.
We don't have anything like that. So what do we teach? Well, we teach the history of the West, and to some degree the history of China and India and the Islamic world, but mainly the history of the West. We teach the history of political philosophy and the principles of American government. Sometimes public policy issues will come up in a politics class, but only secondarily,
right?
Only as a way of illustrating the sort of fundamental principles.
And where all this has come from, not necessarily
right.
What it's
so
into.
There was a time after the Trump election a few years ago when the New York Times sent a reporter out here to try to figure out, do an anthropological expedition to the Midwest.
Bastion.
Yes. And he came to my class, and we were discussing Rousseau, which was not at all what he'd expected.
Right.
He thought this was a seminary for political activists.
This is Fox News of colleges.
Yes, it's anything but.
Right.
So every student takes a course in philosophy. Every student takes a course in theology. Every student takes a course on the U.S. Constitution. The only other schools that require a course on the U.S. Constitution are the military academies.
Isn't that amazing? Wouldn't you think that would be part of everyone's education?
Yes, it ought to be, because it's remarkable what people don't know about it.
Absolutely.
And we teach most of our courses from original source materials. So I'll teach every fall for freshmen a Western Heritage course that starts with the Code of Hammurabi and ends with John Locke. And it's rather rapid. There's very heavy reading.
Yeah.
We assign a textbook to give a kind of background narrative, and we're always in search of a textbook that's relatively short and is focused on the political narrative.
Sure.
The main impetus of the thing are these readings, and we have a reader. And as I said, we'll start with the Code of Hammurabi. There'll be selections from the Jewish Bible, selections from the New Testament, selections from Herodotus, selections
Sure.
from Thucydides, Sallust, Cattle.
All important.
Yeah,
where
right.
we've ended
So,
up.
and then there's an American Heritage course that's very similar.
Mhm.
And again, we're always looking for. We're never very happy with the textbooks because
Yeah.
they're too long,
Right.
and they veer off the course of the political history into lots and lots of social history. And
Right.
it's not that students shouldn't know anything about it. It's that there's so much reading of original source material,
Sure.
the Lincoln Douglas debates, that kind of thing, that you can't overwhelm them with a textbook that's 1,000 pages
Yeah.
long. What we need is a textbook that's 300 pages long and covers the highlights.
Sure.
Then there are upper level courses, of course, that go into much more detail about a particular thing. So I teach Western Heritage every fall, and I teach a graduate course sometime in the year. On what? Thucydides, Machiavelli.
Thucydides is the most important person that most people have never heard of.
Right. Montesquieu, the Scottish Enlightenment, Constitutional Convention. I do a course from time to time on that. And some years I teach 2 graduate courses if we're short of staff, but mostly I just teach one.
Yeah.
And so right now I'm teaching a Machiavelli course, and this year we're short of staff, so in the fall I did a Thucydides course.
It's amazing to me that the majority of my historical information came much after high school, and for the most part after college. And it seems when I say that, I mean history of things like the ancient world, and
right.
There's very little of that at the high school level. I didn't know what the Greek Persian wars were until much later. It seems like we just don't get into it the way maybe we should in the high school.
Or I think we did when I graduated from high school 51 years ago.
Sure.
So what do I remember? But I think we did once over lightly all of those things in high school when I went through.
Yeah.
They've changed things a lot.
It's a lot of American history, which it gets tedious though after a while when you keep going over the Revolutionary War and then the Civil War.
Yeah,
and then,
that's right. Right. But there was not so much world history, but there was a history of the West, and as I said, once over lightly.
Yeah.
My children are at the Hillsdale Academy, which is a kind of laboratory school on the premises of the college and owned by the college. And they certainly get a fair amount of history from ancient Mesopotamia to recent history in Europe, as well as American history.
Yeah.
But the public schools, I'm not so sure about.
Yeah, I was surprised my son had a very brief. My son is 13, and last year as a 7th grader, he got a very brief introduction to Greece and Rome, and it was maybe a few weeks, and then they moved on to something else. And
most colleges have dropped the old Western Civ requirement, and the effect is you can interview a great many college graduates, and they won't know who Charlemagne is.
Right.
They simply
Isn't that
don't.
a fascinating era of history too?
Right,
know?
and you can get people from Harvard and Yale and Princeton who don't.
Yeah.
I was a Rhodes Scholar, and I used to be on the Oklahoma committee. They did it by state, and then there was a regional thing. Now they just go directly to the regionals. So I haven't done this in some years, but I was on the Oklahoma committee for about 30 years, and I was secretary of the committee 2 different patches of time in that. And we used to do, at the end of interviews, we'd do sort of 20 questions. Just asking who was Charlemagne, who was Averroes, who was... and after a while we stopped doing it because none of them knew it.
Yeah.
And that was a sign of a right transformation. This place, it would be shocking if no one knew it.
Right.
And so they do a course in biology, they do a course in chemistry, they do a course in physics. Everyone does a language.
I don't know how familiar you are with podcasts, but have you ever listened to any of Dan Carlin's podcasts?
No, I don't listen to many podcasts, and the reason is this is a small town.
Sure.
I live about 2.5 miles from here.
Yeah.
And the time to listen to a podcast
Right.
is in a car driving somewhere.
If you're ever going on a long car trip and you need something to listen to, Dan Carlin is a former journalist who has the most fascinating podcast in general I've ever listened to, and it's all history related. So he did a 5-part series, which is something like 12 hours on the Achaemenid Persian Empire and up until the Battle of Thermopylae. And then he did another one on Charlemagne. He did another one on just World War I, Countdown for Armageddon it was called. And the one everyone starts with is The Wrath of the Khans, which is a 5-part series on the Mongols from their inception all the way up to the end. And
it sounds like fun.
And he's such an incredible storyteller, that he comes at it, I think, from a journalist's perspective, where he's telling this story and really getting into it. It's amazing. But if you're ever on a long road trip, check that one out. It's something else.
Now, the other kind of thing I'll teach is I'm giving an exam in about an hour in Greek history. Mm-hmm. So it starts with the Mycenaeans and works its way down to Alexander.
Well, let's talk about that. That's why we're here. Why is it?
And I'll teach also undergraduate courses on Machiavelli, or on sometimes I do a course on Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Tocqueville.
Mm-hmm.
And I teach an undergraduate seminar on the Constitutional Convention every once in a while. It's haphazard,
right?
It's sort of hit and miss.
Yeah,
and it depends on the demands on me by the graduate program. And the Thucydides course is sometimes taught for undergraduates as well.
Yeah, he's a fascinating character in history, and I don't have a lot of background on him, but there's so much. He's mentioned everywhere when you talk about the Greeks and the Peloponnesian War,
mm-hmm.
and he's such a central figure in at least that second. What is this? The Second Attic War, I think they would have called it. Is that?
Well, it's very interesting. We talk about the Peloponnesian War, and that's because we are Athenocentric.
Mm-hmm.
And Thucydides talks about the war between the Athenians and the Peloponnesians. There are places in Thucydides where the Peloponnesians are speaking. They call it the Attic War.
Okay.
And I've been doing, nobody's ever written the history of this period from a Spartan perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always been interested in Sparta. I got interested in it when I was a student at Oxford and had a tutor who was interested in it. I later did a dissertation on the Spartan settlement with Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War. And I set out some years ago to do a series of books on Sparta. So
you've done several.
I published one called The Spartan Regime, focused on the origins, the character of the regime and its origins. Mm-hmm. I did one called The Grand Strategy of Classical Sparta, the Persian Challenge, about the Persian Wars. Mm-hmm. And so I looked at the Persian Wars from the perspective, always paying attention to the manner in which the Spartans anticipated these wars, tried to head them off, and the manner in which they adapted the grand strategy they developed in the archaic period to defend their interests and their way of life to an unexpected challenge. Mm-hmm. There hadn't ever been a major power on the scale of the Persians, or say the Assyrians or the Babylonians, that controlled Asia Minor. And there hadn't been a really serious power in Asia Minor since the Hittites. So there's no memory
right.
of a threat from Asia And then suddenly it appears, and it's quite formidable because the Persians, arguably, the greatest empire in human history.
Right.
In this sense, if you think about relative control of resources, of available resources, they've got three of the great river valleys. And in antiquity, the populous places, the rich places, were these river valleys where irrigation was practiced.
Like the
they have
Tigris,
everything
Euphrates.
except the Yellow River in China.
Okay.
They've got the Indus, where there was a great civilization that we don't know much about because we can't crack their writing. There was Mesopotamia with the Tigris and the Euphrates. There was the Nile and Egypt. And the Persians had all of it at the time that they invaded Greece. So they in terms of manpower, in terms of wealth, they could commit a lot to a war.
Right.
And the Greek cities are tiny. Athens is arguably the largest, with 30,000 adult male citizens at the time of the Persian Wars. Sparta has maybe 8 or 9 adult male citizens. It's about the size of Hillsdale.
Oh, wow. Okay.
We're 8,700 people. The Thebans, we don't quite know how many they had, but if you put them together with the other Boeotians, they're probably the same size as Attica. But most of these cities have maybe 3,000 adult male citizens.
Okay.
So it's really tiny.
And what we're dealing with here for the first time, and jumping ahead,
Yeah.
we were jumping right into this, but this is going to be the first real opportunity for these people to come together as quote unquote Greece.
Yeah.
Because the majority of their time, from what I understand, is spent
fighting one another.
Summer, let's go out and bash our neighbors.
Yeah, that's exactly the story. And in truth, at the time of the Persian Wars, there were more Greeks on the side of the Persians than were fighting against them.
Well, it was probably fairly lucrative, right?
Well, and also you want to be on the winning side.
Sure. Yeah.
So the Thebans are on the side of the Persians. The Thessalians are on the side of the Persians.
And if I've got my timeline right, Xenophon's 10,000 came before the invasion, right?
No.
Was that way after?
That's almost a century afterwards.
Okay, all right.
It's 80 years
Okay.
thereafter. In any case, I wrote that book, and the aim of the book was twofold: to tell the story properly from a Spartan angle, but also to tell the story attending to the manner in which regime difference shapes grand strategy.
Mm-hmm.
There's one level in which every state is like every other state. They're all interested in preserving themselves. So there's a way in which you can compare them without attending to differences.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't explain everything. There are things that are done that are a kind of natural extension of the way of life and the way they govern themselves. The Spartans, for example, are very cautious, very conservative, and they're not really interested in maximizing power in the sense of conquest. And the reason is they have a way of life that is a hothouse flower and requires a small inward-looking community in which shame dominates. And the minute you get expansive, the minute you send people abroad, shame's reach.
Sure.
And they become corrupted.
Right.
So they're very, very cautious. The Athenians at the time of the Persian Wars are an agrarian community. They're interested in defending their territory. Mm-hmm. The Persians are in the grips of a religion, a particular kind of Zoroastrianism, that dictates world conquest.
Worshipping Ahura Mazda.
Ahura Mazda, and it's almost monotheist in character, because Ahura Mazda seems to have created the other gods.
Mm-hmm.
So the other gods are more like angels than like gods. They're creatures, and Ahura Mazda is not. And Ahura Mazda has created the whole world. And it's there's a good chance that the Jewish account of the creation is inspired by this Zoroastrianism.
Sure.
We can't be certain about this, but there are remarkable similarities. And there is also a kind of there is a kind of rebellious created God, like Satan, and the world is divided between the realm that is under the control of Ahura Mazda and his servants, and the realm of what the Greeks call, sort of transliterating the Persian, Ahriman.
Okay.
And the one world is a paradise. Paradise is a Persian word meaning garden, and so our paradise in the Bible comes from the Persian word, actually. And in Ahriman's realm, there's disorder. And it is the task of the great king of Persia that he's been given by Ahura Mazda is to bring order out of this disorder. So there's an imperative to conquer. In other words, if you look at the Persian invasion of Greece from the perspective of maximizing power, or the perspective of maximizing the wealth, it's not worth it. The Greeks are poor.
Right.
What they spend conquering it and what they would spend holding it exceeds anything they would get back. Furthermore, they don't gain much in the way of power if they do this.
Right.
So it doesn't make sense, this invasion, except in terms of a kind of crusade, a religious. And in that book, I call it a jihad. I argue that it's the ancestor to the Muslim account.
Sure.
Because in the Muslim account, you get the house of Islam, Dar al-Islam, which is ordered by law given by Allah. And then you have the house of war, the area of disorder. And it's a stunning event that the Greeks actually win this war. And they win it in a certain way through asymmetrical warfare, which is to say the Persian strength derives from manpower and resources deployed, and that creates logistical problems.
So if you've got let's say they send 300,000 men to Greece.
It's probably more like 100,000,
right? Instead of a million
infantrymen, because you can't. You might be able to feed 300,000 with the kind of resources they had, but water.
Right.
Water's a real problem.
Drink the rivers dry.
Yeah, and it's very heavy.
Right.
So you can't carry it with you. Now you might think, well, you could have carts and you could have barrels of water in the carts, but your problem is the animals that pull the carts drink a lot of water.
So a 100,000 man army, you still may have a 300,000 person group with all the attendants and
no, that is a larger question.
You have to feed all of them as well,
and if you can delay them, especially at choke points, two things will happen. They will run out of water, and sometimes food. But the second thing is disease.
Sure.
The role of disease in war is it's been studied, but it's not always attended to. And when an army stays in one place for a time, they foul the water.
Yeah.
And the insects and so forth that live off the feces become a problem because they're spreading. Any kind of disease that hits is likely to go through the army. If you look at Napoleon, there was an attempt under Napoleon to reconquer Haiti. And the army that he sent to Haiti was supposed to take Haiti and then go on to New Orleans and then take on the Americans. And we were saved by the fact that army became desperately sick in Haiti. That can easily happen. So what did the Greeks do? They make the Persians fight in circumstances that are not favorable to the Persians.
Mm-hmm.
So at sea, the Persians have a much larger navy than the Greeks, and a much better trained navy than the Greeks. The Greeks are at the
Greeks
stage.
are new to this, right?
Yeah, amateurs.
Mhm.
Not all of them, but a
And,
good proportion of
Themistocles
them.
is the
The brains behind
brains
the thing.
behind the naval.
And what he
building
does,
even.
against the wishes of the other Greek leaders who are thinking differently, is he lures the Persians into attacking the Greeks in the narrows between Salamis and Attica, where they cannot use, where there's no sea room,
Mhm.
and they cannot use their fleet to good effect. In an encounter that took place where there was sea room, they'd be apt to surround the Greeks.
Sure. It's always
and-
about getting to the flanks.
Yeah.
Whether you're on land or sea.
Right, and the trireme is not very vulnerable at the prow, but it is very vulnerable at the stern.
And that's the basis for sea warfare at this time, right? You're basically ramming into each other's sides, or trying.
Well, there are two ways you fight. You either ram in the starboard side or the other side, the port side, or you ram the stern,
Mhm.
or you pull up alongside and board, and you fight a kind of land battle
Mhm.
on board. The Greeks, if it goes to a land battle, the Greeks have an advantage because their hoplite soldiers, when working in tandem, are superior to the Persian infantry. Persia's strength lies in its cavalry and in its primitive artillery, archers.
Mhm.
The Greeks are able to fend off Persian cavalry, and of course at sea it's of no use at all.
Sure.
And they've got armor that makes them not quite impregnable to artillery attack, to archers, but for the most part.
You know
So-
what's fascinating is you get these two cultures, and maybe this is what I love about battles BC to begin with. You have these two cultures who've rarely seen each other, have very different ways of fighting, because the Greeks have been fighting other Greeks and just banging into each other and pushing and shoving. And then you get the Persians who are used to this steppe warfare where everything's out on a plain and they're able to use
They can
horses
surround
and
you
deer.
with cavalry. They
Now
can,
these two systems collide.
yeah. And so what Themistocles does is he makes the Persian fleet fight in a setting where they cannot bring to bear on the Greeks their numerical superiority.
Right.
And to the extent that they try, their ships are going to run afoul of one another. In this setting, it's impossible to outflank, and it's impossible to get behind.
Right.
So most of these battles actually take place with ships alongside one another and infantry fighting. And in that, the Greeks have an advantage. At the Battle of Plataea the year following, the Spartans do exactly the same thing to the Persians. They lure them onto rough ground where their cavalry cannot function. And the Persians have a shield wall. Behind that shield wall, they have archers and a much smaller number of infantrymen with shields and spears. But
So-
the shields aren't as good as the Greek shields,
Right. Okay.
and they don't work in a phalanx. So all they really have to do is push through the shield wall, and the archers can drop their bows and pick up spears, but they don't have any shields at all.
Right.
So what you get is, once the Greeks push through the shield wall, you get a massacre. Now, if the cavalry had been there, that would be very different,
Right.
because the cavalry could get behind the Greeks, and to actually massacre, the phalanx has to sort of split up.
Sure.
And the minute they split up, they're vulnerable because they're heavily armed and therefore slow moving,
Right.
and they can be hit by cavalry if they're not in the phalanx. If they're in the phalanx, animal behavior comes into play.
So let's talk about that a little bit. When you have a shield wall against cavalry, how does that work out?
The cavalry can charge the shield wall, and the horses will stop.
Right.
And rear, and then you can have your lighter troops come up and get under the horses.
Right.
And so the only way you're vulnerable to cavalry, if you've got a hoplite phalanx, is on the flanks and being hit from behind. And Greece is full of mountains and hills, and a good general will place his troops where they can't be outflanked. And where the enemy can't get around behind them with their cavalry. So what they do at Plataea is they lure the Persians into the foothills of Mount Kithairon, which is a mountain range that lies between Attica and Boeotia, onto rough ground. And so there is no mention of their use of cavalry at all in that particular setting. And then a small group of Greeks can defeat a large group of Persians because they are more or less impregnable to the Persian artillery, to the archers, and they can push through the shield wall. And then you've got people who are essentially naked, and you just kill them, and they do. There's a massive killing that takes place in this setting. So the Greeks have tactics that if they can outwit the Persians and lure them into a setting where the normal advantage of the Persians can't be made use of, they can win.
So we've done this 3 times now. We've done it at Thermopylae, we've done it at Plataea, and we've done it in the sea battle where they've used the structure of Greece along with some.
And there was an earlier battle where the Athenians defeated the Persians at Marathon after the Persians withdrew their cavalry. So they've got a pretty good idea of how to do this. I've written 2 other books. One is in production. It's called Sparta's First Attic War, The Grand Strategy of Classical Sparta, 478 to 446. And it'll be out in September. And then a second book, Sparta's Second Attic War, The Grand Strategy of Classical Sparta, 446 to 418, which focuses on the first part of what Western scholars tend to call the Peloponnesian War.
Right. Do you have your own website? I mean, I've seen them all on Amazon.
I do have a website. I have not updated it in a while. PaulARahe.com, and Rahe is spelled R-A-H-E.
R-A-H-E.
Yeah. And the various books I've written are discussed there, though these 2 new ones aren't. The first one I said is in production, meaning I have seen and gone over the page proofs. I've done the index. I've gone over the page proofs for the index. There's nothing left that I can do
on your end.
Yes.
Waiting
Mistakes that have been made are there, and I can't fix them. I have a second one, the Second Attic War, which I will turn in for copy editing on the 1st of May. So I have the draft of maps right here, and one of the things I will do this weekend is go over the maps very carefully to tweak them. Because there's just a little bit that needs changing, and I went to Greece over spring vacation, so just a couple weeks ago.
Oh wow!
Beautiful time of year, March. It's in the 50s and 60s. 1 day of rain out of 12, and I went to places I hadn't been before where battles took place, just to look things over. And then I went back to places I hadn't seen in 40 years to make sure that my intuitions about the shape of the terrain were correct. You can visit these things with Google Earth, and it's very helpful. But there is no street view in rural areas. So you can't see it from the side.
I'm a firm believer, though, you go to these places as well, and you get, we spent some time in some of the Mayan ruins down in Mexico.
Oh.
And you get a vibe down there, the energy, woo woo or whatever. But to visit these places where these incredible moments in history have taken place is, I think,
Right.
is important if you're interested in this stuff at all, to get that energy from those places.
It's to give you a sense of places I went to. We went to Corfu, Corcyra, and I was interested in where the naval battles took place, which is just off the coast, very close to it, and you could see the channel in which they fought. There was also in the mountains in the northeast. And the mountains are formidable. There was a group of oligarchs who built a fort and began raiding, and I'd never seen those mountains, so I wanted to see that. And then we went to the Peloponnesus, to where the Battle of Mantinea took place in 418. A very important battle. It's the moment when the Athenians might have eliminated Sparta as a great power, and Thucydides' description is not quite adequate. He tells us that the Spartans they're marching north from Tegea. You've got to think of a plain that's like an hourglass, and in the middle of the plain, in the narrow part of the hourglass, there are two ridges that come out from the mountains, and it's a very, very flat plain. It's amazingly flat, given, it's like Waco, Texas.
Sure.
And in Greece, there's very few places that are that flat, and it's well watered, which is also bizarre in Greece. But it's it's a high plateau, and there are mountains all around it. The Spartans are supposedly marching north from the territory of Tegea back to their camp, which is just around the bend of one of the ridges in the territory of Mantinea. And Thucydides' description says they came upon the Argive army, the Argives and Athenians and Mantineans, and they were surprised and really shocked, and had to rapidly deploy from column into phalanx. And he says it was very impressive because Spartans are really good at that. Right. They drill.
Sure.
The Spartans drill, and drill. They are not really amateurs the way the other Greeks are. And an emergency like that, they're very well prepared for. Well, the question that no one's adequately answered is, why were they surprised? And one possibility is there was a grove of trees in the way. And something like 600 years later, there was a grove of trees.
Oh, wow.
But Thucydides doesn't mention it.
Right.
There's a later battle there, and Xenophon doesn't mention it. And there's yet another battle there, and Polybius doesn't mention it. It's one of these places where battles take place.
Right.
Because if you control this area, you control much larger areas.
Right.
And I, looking at the maps and then going to Google Earth, thought, maybe the Argives are hiding behind the ridge. And to know whether that's plausible, you've got to go there.
Yeah.
Because it's got to be flat land behind the ridge, and the ridge has to be high enough that you would be unseen until the last minute. And I'm sure that's exactly what happened, because the grove of trees, 600 years later, things like that can change and are apt to. And nobody else mentions it, which is odd. But the ridge today is pretty much what the ridge was then. And if you are on one side of that ridge, especially close to the tip of the ridge with an army, you won't be seen until the last minute. So that's one thing I wanted to figure out. The other thing is that there's a very important series of armed conflicts that takes place at a place called Pylos or Coryphasium. This is in the Bay of Navarino on the west coast of Messenia, where the Athenians establish a fort on a headland and the headland is mostly impregnable. It's cliffs on the landward side and much of the seaward side. And they fortify certain places where you can get access. And the Spartans try to take it. And what the Athenians do is put Messenians there, who are of the same nationality as the Helots in the larger area of Messenia, on which the Spartans depend for their wealth.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something that might set off a Helot revolt, and so it's very important to the Spartans. And it's a sort of hit the Spartans in their soft underbelly.
Right.
And I'd been there before in 1973. And there's an island in the bay that plays a role in this, and I'd walked the island and remember it pretty well. But I hadn't clambered over the headland. And I wanted to, and I went to it with Google Earth, and you can see a lot, but you can't see it from the sides.
Right.
Because
can't see it how
there's no town there with houses, so there's I wanted to know how easy is it at the access point to get up, and how hard would it be to get up elsewhere. And that was fascinating because on the eastern side of this headland that runs north-south, it's just a rock climber could go up the cliff.
Sure.
75 rock climbers as part of a military effort. No, they can't do that.
Yeah.
So you just can't attack it from that angle. They try to attack from the sea, where the slope is not vertical.
Mm-hmm.
But what you've got is solid rock going out to the sea, and you don't have a beach, so you can't beach the ship and unload it. What you have to do is ram it into the rock, and then people have to jump off. And when they're jumping off, they're terribly vulnerable.
Sure.
And they have to clamber over a kind of rolling, rocky beach, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And that's where Demosthenes, the Athenian general, puts most of his people. So, and what they do is a ship comes in and they go after the guys and kill them. And I wanted to see that. How impossible was it? And it was great fun, a beautiful day. And at this time of year in Greece, it's not dry, and there are flowers everywhere. Just a riot of flowers.
Yeah.
And the answer is an out-of-shape, sedentary, asthmatic, septuagenarian professor could, at the point of access, could easily go up into the headland, and he did. And once there, you can look down upon this stone area where they tried to get in, and you can see that virtually impossible to do if there's resistance. If there's no resistance, hard, but you could do it. But you're vulnerable. The hoplites who get off the ship are fighting as individuals and not in phalanx, because you can't lay out a phalanx there. And you're vulnerable to attacks by lighter armed troops who are much more agile than you are. And if the thing is resisted vigorously, it just can't be done.
Yeah.
And it never does get done. And they're there for something like 16 years.
Wow.
So it's now the area of access, which is rather narrow. Really, there's room. I'd say it's about 30 yards of space where you could go up. So you could have 2 or 3 paths there, but that's about it. There it's pretty easy, and that's where they built walls. And the walls had to be pretty good. They must have built them fairly high, and they must have built them well, and the Athenians knew how to do that.
Yeah.
But it was great fun to go there, and it confirmed my suspicions about how this thing worked.
Yeah, it gives you a nice when you're writing history on the other side of the world, it's probably extremely helpful. Like you said,
Right.
you see all these things that just don't make sense to you, and you start to figure some things out. When we're talking about the Spartan regime in general, why do you think, as a society, we are so in tuned and so obsessed with this one small city-state as opposed to Athens or the Band of Brothers in Thebes or something like that? What draws us as a society to emulate and almost worship this small Greek city-state in?
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, we I don't know of a sports team called the Athenians.
Right. We're here next to Michigan. Well, not next to Michigan State.
It's pretty close,
Yeah.
Michigan State. It's and you know, nationwide there are Spartans here, there, and everywhere
Right.
in terms of sports teams. Part of it is Thermopylae.
Mm-hmm.
Just the sacrifice of the 300 guys who can hold back an army of perhaps 100,000, and you've got 300 Spartans supported by maybe another 1,000 Greeks, and they sort of rotate in and out of the battle line, and they hold a rather narrow space. By the way, I went to Thermopylae shortly before publishing the Persian Challenge
Mm-hmm.
book. The example of that is very impressive. It impressed the Greeks no end.
Right.
And it put a burden on the remaining Spartans. They had to live up to that
It's a
standard.
big reputation to live up to.
Yeah, right. So that's part of it. Now, as for the sacred band in Thebes, it's not around long enough to make much of an
Sure.
impression, and it's an imitation of Sparta.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something like that at Argos in, say, 421 to 418. There's 1,000 Argives who spent all their time training and function rather well. So, but Sparta, you've got a couple hundred years in which they are organized in this fashion,
Right.
and they win. They lead the coalition that beats the Persians, and in the crucial battle at Plataea, they're the ones who do it, and they defeat the Athenians, which is remarkable. The Athenians outnumber them by quite a few.
Yeah.
And the Spartans are on the defensive through much of the war, and yet they pull it off. Now, how is it that they pull it off? And I think that's what causes them to be inspiring, and why there are movies about the 300 and
Right.
so forth. Often fairly fictional, but still.
Yeah.
The crucial thing about them is discipline. Just astonishing discipline.
Something we can admire as a
Yeah.
fairly undisciplined society, too.
Right, yes.
strive
And the
for
more
that.
undisciplined we are, the more impressive they
Yes.
are to us. And, why are they so successful? Well, they build their whole way of life around producing soldiers who can function in this phalanx and win. And if you look at the Battle of Mantinea as an example, you can see why they win. It's a very close run fight. And on one side, the Argive 1,000, whom I've just mentioned, and the Mantineans defeat Sparta's allies and even a small group of Spartans who are quartered with their allies. And they push right through and kill a lot of people. On the other side, where the Spartans are ranged against the Argives cut and run at the moment of contact. They're just overawed.
Mm-hmm.
And the way the Spartans, having won on one side of the battle and lost on the other side of the battle, the way they win is they don't pursue the Argives. And it is Spartan policy, unless their king gives the order, that they remain in phalanx. And what they do on this occasion is then he has them wheel and go after the victorious Mantineans and the Argive 1000. They are still in phalanx. The Mantineans and the 1000 are pursuing, and the minute you pursue, the phalanx breaks up.
Right.
So had the Mantineans and the Argives quartered with them, had the discipline the Spartans had, they would have won on their side of the battle, and they would have wheeled and come in at the back of the Spartans, and they'd have been crushed between the main Argive army and these Mantineans and the 1000 Argives, and they'd have won. So how is it that the Spartans win? The answer is they are just much more disciplined and drilled than any other army.
And that starts at age 7.
Yes,
with
that's right.
The male child is taken away from the mother. And can you speak a little bit about the agoge?
Well, the agoge is a kind of preparation for manhood. And if you look at the Cub Scouts and the Boy Scouts, it's a kind of soft imitation of this.
Okay.
And look, the Cub Scouts, this might be of interest to you.
Sure.
The Cub Scouts and the Boy Scouts and explorers and all of that was started in the early 20th century by a British general named Baden-Powell. And it began at that moment in human history when the majority of, in most countries in the West, the majority of people were living in cities for the first time in human history.
Right.
America was majority agrarian until 1920. I don't know the numbers on England or Germany or wherever, but the pattern is the same.
Yeah.
Which is to say, industry is drawing people into the cities. Improvements in agricultural technique are reducing the need for laborers in the countryside. And there is a conviction that grows up that the English are getting soft. And so Baden-Powell founds the Boy Scouts to toughen up young English boys. And it's picked up in Germany and France and the United States and everywhere else. And there is a concern with instilling manliness. And
the same concern I have.
Yeah. And it's and of course the Boy Scouts are now beleaguered in this country because we've turned our back on manliness.
Sure.
But if you think of the generation of Teddy Roosevelt when he was, he's a very good example of a citified kid who becomes tough.
Sure.
And was a big supporter of the Boy Scouts. All the progressives of that period were. In fact.
Even up to John F. Kennedy wrote the book, wrote the article for Sports Illustrated, the Soft American, where we needed to get back to these hardened up children.
And Sparta was, in some measure, an inspiration for this.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, the other appeal of Sparta is it's a total life. It is a political community that is a religious community. There's no sort of division. The two heads of the eagle are united. It is a political community in which your relations with your fellow citizens are everything. So they downplay the family. Children are taken away from their mothers at the age of 7. And they go into sort of packs of kids of the same age, and they are put through drills, and they are taught to wrestle and to fight, and they learn how to use weapons, and they learn how to camp, and and as they get older, the training gets rougher, from say 12 on. And it's roughly the division between Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts that is reflected in this. And it's also a division between childhood and early adolescence. And so by the time that they join the Sycidia, which is at the same time a military squad and a dining society.
It's like a social club, you and
Yeah.
your mates.
Right. And by that time, they're really completely acclimated. And of course, they've been separated from their families. We send people off to college, and they leave their parents behind at 18. These kids leave their parents behind at 7.
You know, it was interesting when I was reading about that there's very little, it seemed to be there was very little contact between the fathers and the sons growing up. But there was such, and you know, in our society, that's a huge problem that we have. We have fatherless homes and,
Yeah.
you know, women raising boys. But the women in Sparta were as venerated as the men, seemingly. They were these incredible heroes in their own right.
You're right.
Did I get this wrong? The only way you could have a headstone or a marker for your grave in Sparta is if you were a man who died in battle or a female who died in childbirth.
Yes,
They were
that's right.
seen
That's
as
yeah.
the same thing.
No, the women are the producers of these men. And, you know, there's the famous story of the woman who hands her son his shield, and she says, "Come back with it or on it." Okay, on it means dead.
That's one of my all-time favorites.
Yeah, and so the women are on board with this. And the women are relatively free at Sparta. And they dress in a, if you look at Athens, it's almost like Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
The women are confined. Now, poor women aren't confined because they can't. But, you know, if you can afford it, your women are at home.
Mm-hmm.
And you get jokes about the fact that the women are pasty-faced because they don't go out in the sun. It's the men who go out in the sun. So there's a sharp inside-outside division. Sparta, it's not like that.
Right.
And the women are athletic.
But now, do they go through some form of training themselves?
Not that we know of a kind of formal training, though, again, the sources are biased in the sense that they're focused on men.
Sure.
So it could be that my answer is wrong, but we don't know of any such thing.
There's definitely some form of, in the readings that I've done, that there's some form of, these are different women, and maybe it's because the society is so different and so based around more freedom for these women, that they're stronger, that they're, you know, healthier, they're more beautiful. I've read
Their
some
skirts are slit,
right,
so you can see their legs.
right.
And this shows up in Athenian comedy. There's a kind of obsession with these Spartan women,
Right.
And the separation of the boy from the mother may intensify the relationship rather than reduce its significance.
Something you're lacking, and
there's a kind of longing on
Yeah.
both sides, I suspect, because we have all these stories about Spartan women. We don't have stories about Athenian women. And it may derive from a kind of intense interest in the well-being of the son who's been removed from your family.
Yeah, right.
There may be a kind of wound there that, and the boy may be intensely dedicated to his mother in a similar way. The father's a more distant figure,
Mm-hmm.
and the Sycidia, where the men dine in the evening, is also where they sleep. So sexual relations between a man and his wife take place on the sly at night.
Sneaking away from
Right.
yeah.
And what it means is he's not really part of a household with the woman in a kind of practical day-to-day
Sure.
household management sort of way. Now that changes at a certain age, and there's a debate about what age. I think it's late. I think it's 45,
Mm-hmm.
when the men are seniors, so to speak, and are no longer, they're sort of military reserves at that stage. They're still liable to be called up.
Sure.
And when they call up an army, they call up age classes. So they do it by age class. And these would be the guys at the back of the phalanx.
Right. They spent their time. They've shed
Or
their
they
blood.
would be left as guards to guard the territory of Laconia and Messenia against a possible Helot revolt when the army goes off. At 60, they're sort of retired altogether from the army.
Now that's interesting, but Leonidas was supposedly in his 60s when
He might have been.
when Thermopylae happened.
He might have been. He's the younger brother of Cleomenes. There's a reasonable chance that he's certainly 50s plus, but he's the king, and that's a completely different.
But what I'm trying to think is, here's a man in his late 50s or his 60s, arguably the hardest, most brutal battle in history, at least to that time.
You know, think of Jim Mattis, the Marine.
Sure, Mad Dog,
and he's a tough character. I know him slightly.
Yeah.
There's an outfit connected with the Hoover Institution called Strategica, and it's involves a meeting of sort of military historians to discuss contemporary issues in the light of military history. And on one occasion, he attended everything. This was before he was Secretary of Defense and after he'd left the Marines. I wouldn't want to take him on.
Is there any way you could talk him into running for president? Get a hold of him, maybe?
Yeah, I don't, I don't know him well enough that he'd give me the time of day with regard to something like that. And I have no idea whether he would want to.
You see that a lot with military guys who you wish would run for president, but they don't want the
and keep in mind he's a
nonsense
Democrat, and would they ever nominate a general?
Sure.
These days.
Right.
They might nominate a general if they get walloped very, very badly, repeatedly. That in desperation they might turn to someone like Mattis. But that's what it would take. Would be desperation. And he's he's alert enough, I'm sure.
And I'm probably still in shape, at that age. That I don't.
Yes, I would. He certainly seemed to be. It's been 5 years maybe since I've seen him. He certainly seemed to be in shape, and he's a kind of model Marine, and those guys tend to put an emphasis on being combat ready.
Right.
The Marines are probably the branch of our military that are most Spartan in their spirit.
Were they modeled? Was the original? I mean, because we talk about Marines in Greek warfare, them having Marines. And I was wondering, is there some kind of...
the Marines in Greek warfare are hoplites serving on board ships.
Right.
Yeah. But they're also hoplites serving on board ships that can be landed and can be an amphibious force the way our Marines
Sounds
are.
very much like ours, right?
Yeah, that's right. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know the history of the Marines well enough, but are they aware of Sparta? Oh, yes, they're aware of Sparta. I gave a talk once at the Marine Corps University at Quantico, and this is a world of people who are interested in such things.
I was going to say, that must have been a very captivated audience.
Oh, yeah, they're fun.
Yeah.
They're fun. And I have a former student who teaches there, so and Mattis is very interested in Thucydides, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
But militaries worldwide are interested in these questions. And this last week I'm doing a Machiavelli seminar for the graduate students, and we spent a week on Machiavelli's Art of War, and it's very striking just how much that book has been influenced by the Spartan example.
Sure. Yeah.
He's the emphasis that he places is on drill, and more drill. And the theme of it is the Army ought to be able, in any kind of emergency, to reform itself and fight an attack from the right upon command, everyone in place, and fight an attack on the left, or if you're attacked from all sides, to form a square and they ought to have drilled and drilled so that when they find themselves in an unexpected situation, they know exactly what to do, and they do it. Well, that's the story that Thucydides tells of the Spartans at the beginning of the Battle of Mantinea. They're in column. And in antiquity, probably true today too, an army in column is extremely vulnerable.
Sure.
There's no depth to it. There's they're not ready. And turning from column into phalanx, that can be a messy act if it's amateurs who are doing it.
Yeah.
If it's pros who have done it 1,000
Know
times,
exactly where to go every
yeah,
time.
and they know what the commands mean,
Right.
and absolutely precise commands. And there is a Thucydides who's clearly very impressed by this, and I suspect was an eyewitness. I suspect he was there,
Right.
maybe on top of one of these ridges, watching the thing unfold, because this is in the territory of Mantinea, and there are guardhouses at the top of those ridges,
Right.
ancient guardhouses. So
He's watching them just snap into
yeah,
formation.
the Mantineans almost certainly have people up there, so they know where the Spartans are, and the
Right.
Spartans don't know where they are, and that's and he's watching this thing happen, and it's an ambush basically.
Yeah.
And the Spartans are startled by the appearance of this army, all arrayed for war, and the Spartans are in column. And what interests Thucydides is there is a kind of pecking order, a hierarchy of officers, and the order goes to the polemarchs, and then the order gets passed down, and it just goes zoom, zoom, zoom,
Yeah.
zoom, zoom, and they're
And just watch
they're-
it happen from above.
Yeah. Whereas if they'd been hit when they were in column, it would have been hopeless for them.
Right. Yeah. Drill, drill, drill. That's the
Yeah, that's right. And
military
you know, the
and-
Athenians aren't drilled that well. The Argive 1000 are, and eventually the Sacred Band at Thebes is drilled that well.
yeah.
But the main Argive army is amateurs. And they may have done some work, but they're kind of weekend warriors, if
Right.
you know what I mean.
There's a big difference when your number one priority in life is to be a good soldier and do things perfectly, as opposed
That's
to
right.
I'm
Yeah.
a poet and I
Yeah.
do this on the weekends.
Right, and so the kind of training the Spartans receive at every stage is meant to harden them and to prepare them to cope with the unexpected. And the other thing is the Syssidia is set up so you, like an army squad. So when you fight, you are fighting together with people you know very well and you care about.
That was the idea in World War I too, I think, with the British, where they had kids from their own neighborhoods.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually, a Civil War. If you think
Okay.
of the American Civil War, the army units were from localities,
Sure.
and they were made up of people who were apt to know one another before they joined the military.
Yeah.
But the other side of it is you can get to know one another, and that kind of loyalty increases your willingness to fight, especially if, and this is true in the phalanx, if you flinch, the people likely to be killed are the people to your right and to your left and immediately behind you.
Yeah.
And if they're your buddies, you're more likely to fight to the death
Right.
in these circumstances. Now, the other thing is sexual. The Spartans systematically practiced pederasty, and that means a sexual relationship between a man in his 20s or older and a boy going through the agoge who's 14 or 15 or something along those lines.
Right.
And the main romantic interest in their lives are often homosexual rather than heterosexual.
You see that through a lot of Greek. I mean, even back towards the Iliad with.
Actually, it's not
Achilles.
there in the Iliad.
Well, I always got the impression
They're very close friends,
Achilles
but they've
and
got women.
Patroclus.
And you have a discussion of sex with the women. You
Right.
have no discussion of sex with men. What's interesting is when you get to Aeschylus, and he retells the story, he makes Achilles and Patroclus lovers.
Okay.
So there is an ethos change between the world depicted by Homer, which would be the Mycenaean age and maybe the very early Archaic age, and the world of the polis.
Okay.
And in the world of the polis, there is this institutionalized pederasty that plays a significant role in Greek life.
So, like, the political climate or the sentiments of that age have now affected this story from a much earlier time.
Yeah, that's right. They rewrite the story to
Right.
fit their circumstance. We do this.
We do it all the
Yeah.
time, sure.
So the connection between husband and wife may be less close than the connection between two men in the same Sycidia.
Right.
Obviously it'll vary with individual cases and so forth, but there's a kind of dismantling of the family.
Right.
It's not complete; it's partial. And the function of the dismantling of the family is to intensify the tie to the city by way of this Sycidia.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to work very powerfully. And so you don't have stories about Spartan women and their husbands.
Right.
Not much. You have stories about Spartan women and their sons.
Yeah.
Now there are cultures. I mean, modern Greece. They say about modern Greeks that every boy looks on his mother as the Virgin Mary, and every
Sure.
mother looks on her boy as Jesus Christ. They don't mention the husband.
Right.
And so there's an intense relationship between mothers and
Yeah.
sons in modern Greece. So there can be tremendous variation in
Sure.
cultures. But here there's this pederasty element to it.
Right.
And it's true, it varies from one Greek city to another, but there's an element of it everywhere in
Yeah.
Greece, as far as we can tell. The Spartans practice it systematically.
Okay.
And it's a kind of, fraternities. There's a big brother, little brother
Sure.
relationship.
You take care of them.
It's a kind of mentorship relationship, intensified by the sexual dimension of the relations.
One thing I wanted to get into, and you've got a heart out here, so we got about 5-6 more minutes tops, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on some of the pop culture references involving Spartans in society, and I'm sure you've seen the movie 300 and cringed at it.
Actually, I haven't
You
seen
haven't?
it. No,
Okay.
I don't get to see many movies.
It's obviously a cartoonish
Yeah,
version
that's
of it.
right.
But what was nice, and what people may not understand, is that there was a lot of these one-liners that actually came from Herodotus. And
Yeah.
You thought this was some kind of Hollywood invention, but how about Gates of Fire with the Stephen Pressfield book? Did you ever get a chance to
Nope.
read that?
No.
We have to get you on Dan Carlin, and we have to get you watching some of these movies. Yeah, Gates of Fire was a fantastic historical fiction account of the Battle of Thermopylae and leading up to it. And
I've heard of it. I've just never found the
Fantastic
time to
book.
read it.
Well, I'm going to let you go. I would
Yeah, I
love
need
to do
to-
this again sometime, and you've got some tests to give out. So I appreciate you having us up here. And again, if you want to give them your website real quick.
It's paularahe.com. One word, Paul, PaulArahe.com. And you can wander through it and you'll find all the books.
There you go.
And the Sparta's First Attic War will be published by Yale University Press on, I believe, the 1st of September this year.
Fantastic.
And Sparta's Second Attic War is scheduled for the 1st of September 2020. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This has been The Refined Savage. See you guys.
Hey, I hope you guys dug that one with Dr. Paul Rahe and the Spartans and the Battle for the West. We hope to get more of those on for you. So go to the website, therefinedsavage.com, buy some gear. And if you know of any sponsors, send them our way. We're trying to get the best guests we can on the show, and that takes a little bit of coin. So support the show, and we will get the best guests on we can possibly find. On next week's show, we have Q&A with my right-hand man, Hand of the King, Zach Pape. We did a Q&A from the internets And you guys actually responded with a bunch of questions. So we did a nice little Q&A, answered everybody's questions, tried not to be too snarky, and I hope you enjoy that one.